Along the fog-shrouded coastline of Massachusetts, where the Atlantic winds carry whispers of forgotten sins, stands a crumbling stone marker that few dare approach. Local fishermen cross themselves when they pass it, and even the boldest historians refuse to speak openly about what it commemorates. The marker bears only a date, 1687, and two names that once struck terror into the hearts of every God-fearing colonist: Ezekiel and Judith Harrington. For nearly 2 decades, these siblings built an empire of blood and accusation, growing wealthy from the screams of the innocent and the seizure of their properties. But when their unholy union produced twin children so grotesquely malformed that even the most hardened physicians fled in horror, the people whispered that divine justice had finally found them. What really happened in that isolated manor house, where 8-year-old children with twisted bodies and brilliant minds plotted against their own parents, remained buried beneath layers of fear and superstition, until now. Before we continue with the story of the Harrington siblings and their terrible legacy, I want you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one, stories that most people would rather forget, are exactly what we uncover here. Also, let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from, as these dark tales are scattered across every corner of America. The truth about the Harrington fortune and its cursed inheritors reveals a level of calculated evil that would make even the most hardened observer question what humanity is truly capable of when greed overrides conscience. The Massachusetts Bay Colony of the 1660s existed in a state of perpetual religious fervor and economic struggle. Small coastal communities like Wickham's Harbor, a settlement of barely 300 souls nestled between rocky cliffs and pine forests, survived on fishing, farming, and an uneasy relationship with the supernatural beliefs that governed every aspect of colonial life. The Puritan doctrine demanded constant vigilance against Satan's influence, and in such isolated communities, suspicion could spread faster than wildfire. Ezekiel Harrington, at 28 years old, possessed the sharp features and piercing grey eyes that would later become synonymous with accusation and judgment. His younger sister Judith, 25 and equally striking in her austere beauty, shared the same angular jaw and cold demeanor. But where Ezekiel commanded attention through presence, Judith wielded influence through whispered words and carefully planted doubts. Both siblings had received education unusual for their station. Their father, a failed merchant from Boston, had insisted on teaching them to read, write, and most importantly, to understand the legal intricacies of property ownership and inheritance law. When their parents died of fever in 1663, leaving the siblings with little more than a modest farmhouse and mounting debts, they faced the same bleak prospects as countless other young colonists. But unlike their neighbors who turned to honest labor or trade, the Harrington siblings recognized an opportunity in the growing hysteria surrounding witchcraft. Communities throughout New England had begun employing witch-finders, individuals who claimed special knowledge in identifying servants of Satan. These professionals could command substantial fees for their services, and more lucratively, they often received portions of the condemned's confiscated property. The siblings' first client was the village of Milford, 2 days' ride inland, where crop failures and stillborn livestock had created an atmosphere ripe for supernatural explanations. Ezekiel presented himself as a learned man who had studied the signs of witchcraft, while Judith posed as his assistant, skilled in the art of detecting hidden marks upon the accused. Their method was brutally simple. They would arrive in a troubled community, study the local dynamics of wealth and power, then systematically accuse those whose properties would prove most profitable once confiscated. The widow Constance Fletcher became their first victim, a woman whose late husband had left her a valuable grain mill that several local men coveted. Under the Harrington siblings' careful orchestration, Constance found herself accused of blighting the harvest through unholy communion with dark forces. The evidence they presented seemed overwhelming. Mysterious marks upon her body, which they had secretly inflicted during a forced examination. testimony from neighbors who claimed to have seen her muttering strange words, coached by Judith's careful suggestions, and the damning fact that her mill continued to produce flour when others failed, actually the result of her superior maintenance and location. Constance Fletcher was hanged on November 15, 1664, and her mill was divided between the town and the Harrington siblings as payment for their services. But this was merely the beginning of an enterprise that would eventually span 8 different communities and claim the lives of 57 innocent people over the course of 15 years. The decision for Ezekiel and Judith to marry came not from any romantic inclination. Such unions between siblings were technically possible under colonial law when justified by compelling circumstances, but from cold, practical calculation. By 1675, the siblings controlled assets worth more than £15,000, an enormous fortune by colonial standards. They owned property in 9 different communities, held mortgages on dozens of farms and businesses, and possessed detailed records of their various criminal activities spanning more than a decade. The problem they faced was one of inheritance and security. If either sibling married outside the family, their spouse would gain legal rights to a portion of their wealth, and more dangerously, potential access to the carefully guarded secrets that had made their fortune possible. Similarly, if either sibling died without direct heirs, complex inheritance laws might result in their assets being distributed among distant relatives or even claimed by the colonial government. Their solution demonstrated the same ruthless pragmatism that had characterized their entire careers. Ezekiel, as the elder sibling, would marry Judith in a private ceremony performed by a corrupt minister they had compromised during a witch trial in Salem Village. The union would be kept secret from the wider community, presented instead as a business partnership between confirmed spinster and bachelor who had dedicated their lives to serving God through the identification and elimination of supernatural threats. The secret wedding took place on December 21st, 1675, during the winter solstice, a date chosen for its symbolic significance rather than any supernatural beliefs. The ceremony was held in the basement of their manor, witnessed only by the corrupt minister and 2 servants who had been threatened into silence. The wedding itself was a mockery of Christian tradition, performed not in celebration of love or spiritual union, but as a legal maneuver designed to protect their accumulated wealth and shared secrets. The pregnancy that began in early 1676 seemed to validate the siblings' confidence in their unholy arrangement. Judith's condition progressed normally through the first several months, with no signs of complications or abnormalities. The siblings hired a skilled midwife from Boston, paying her an extraordinary fee to relocate temporarily to their manor and provide the best possible care. They ordered special foods, imported medicines, and even commissioned matching cradles crafted from the finest mahogany and fitted with silk bedding suitable for children destined to inherit great wealth. But as Judith's pregnancy advanced into its final trimester, subtle signs began to emerge that something was terribly wrong. The first indication came during the 7th month, when Judith began experiencing movements that the midwife described as unusual in their violence and coordination. Sarah Whitcomb, the experienced midwife who had delivered more than 300 babies throughout her career, had never felt fetal movements quite like those occurring within Judith's womb. Rather than the typical patterns of kicks and turns that characterized normal development, these movements seemed to involve multiple entities engaged in what could only be described as combat. "It's as though they're fighting each other," Sarah confided to her assistant, a young woman named Emma Prescott, who had come from Boston to help with what was expected to be a routine, if secretive, delivery. "I've delivered twins before, many times, but never have I felt such aggressive motion. It's almost as if they're trying to harm one another." Ezekiel dismissed these concerns as the superstitious imaginings of an old woman, but privately he began to worry. The siblings had invested too much in this pregnancy to accept that anything might go wrong, and Ezekiel threw himself into research designed to explain and address whatever complications might arise. He purchased every medical text available in the colonies, corresponded with physicians in London and Edinburgh, and even consulted with several midwives from other regions to gather information about difficult births and abnormal developments. What he discovered in his research was both reassuring and deeply disturbing. Multiple texts confirmed that twin pregnancies often involved more violent fetal movements than single births, particularly when the children were competing for limited space and resources within the womb. But several sources also mentioned increased risks associated with what they termed close kinship between parents, including higher rates of stillbirth, physical abnormalities, and mental deficiencies in surviving offspring. The birth, when it finally began on March 15, 1677, lasted for nearly 2 days and involved complications that would haunt Sarah Whitcomb for the remainder of her life. The twins that emerged were immediately recognizable as severely malformed, with limbs that branched at impossible angles, skulls that seemed to have developed additional bony protrusions, and bodies that appeared to be connected by tissue bridges that linked their torsos and possibly internal organs. What truly shocked the attending women was the realization that these children possessed an awareness and coordination that seemed far beyond their apparent developmental stage. They moved with purpose, grasped objects placed near them, and seemed to communicate with each other through a series of sounds and gestures that neither midwife could interpret. Despite their severe physical abnormalities, the twins demonstrated intelligence that was both remarkable and deeply unsettling. The children, whom Ezekiel and Judith named Gabriel and Raphael, choosing biblical names that might provide some protection against supernatural interpretation of their condition, survived their difficult birth and began to grow in ways that defied every expectation about children born with such severe deformities. By their first birthday, it was clear that their intelligence far exceeded normal developmental milestones, even as their physical limitations became more pronounced. The years between 1677 and 1685 marked both the height of the Harrington siblings' power and the beginning of their greatest challenge. As Gabriel and Raphael grew from infants into children, their unique combination of severe physical deformities and extraordinary intelligence created problems that went far beyond simple medical care. The boys, for they were indeed male twins, despite their unusual shared anatomy, required constant supervision and specialized attention that made maintaining the siblings' public careers increasingly difficult. By the time the twins reached their 8th birthday in March of 1685, they had developed into something unprecedented in colonial Massachusetts. Severely disabled children who possessed intellectual capabilities that rivaled those of educated adults. Despite their inability to walk normally or engage in typical childhood activities, Gabriel and Raphael had taught themselves to read by age 4, had mastered basic mathematics by age 5, and by their 7th year were engaging in philosophical discussions that would have challenged university students. But perhaps most disturbing of all was their growing awareness of their parents' true nature and activities. The twins had been kept isolated within the manor for their entire lives, officially to protect them from cruel stares and supernatural fears, but actually to prevent anyone from witnessing their condition and connecting it to divine judgment upon their parents' crimes. This isolation, however, had given them unprecedented access to their parents' private conversations, business records, and planning sessions for their various criminal enterprises. Gabriel and Raphael had developed an uncanny ability to remain silent and motionless when adults entered their vicinity, leading Ezekiel and Judith to discuss sensitive matters freely in their presence, assuming the children were too young or too disabled to understand what they were hearing. This assumption proved to be a catastrophic mistake that would ultimately lead to the siblings' destruction. By 1685, the twins possessed detailed knowledge of their parents' witch-hunting operations, including specific information about manufactured evidence, bribed witnesses, and the systematic murder of innocent people for financial gain. More significantly, they had begun to understand that their own physical condition was not the result of divine judgment or random misfortune, but rather the direct consequence of their parents' decision to marry within their bloodline, to protect their criminal empire. This understanding had filled the children with a mixture of rage, grief, and determination that was remarkable in its intensity and sophistication. Despite their physical limitations and their complete dependence on their parents for basic care, Gabriel and Raphael had begun planning ways to expose the truth about the Harrington criminal enterprise and secure justice for their parents' victims. The twins' first opportunity to act on their knowledge came in the summer of 1685, when a young woman named Margaret Caldwell arrived at the manor seeking employment as a servant. Margaret was the daughter of one of Ezekiel and Judith's earlier victims, a blacksmith named Thomas Caldwell, who had been executed for witchcraft in 1679 after the siblings had orchestrated his accusation to acquire his valuable forge and prime real estate in the center of Hadley's Crossing. Margaret had no idea that the Harrington siblings were responsible for her father's death. She knew only that they were wealthy, respected members of the community who might provide employment for a young woman left destitute by family tragedy. What she discovered during her residence at the manor, however, was evidence that would eventually lead to the most significant witch trial scandal in colonial American history. The twins' strategy for communicating with Margaret was both ingenious and heartbreaking. Despite their severe speech impediments and physical limitations, they had developed ways of leaving written messages in locations where she would find them during her cleaning duties. These messages began simply with basic information about hidden documents and suspicious financial records, but gradually expanded to include detailed instructions about where to find evidence of their parents' crimes. More importantly, Gabriel and Raphael had learned to distinguish between their parents' different visitors, and had developed ways of warning Margaret when particularly dangerous individuals were scheduled to arrive at the manor. They had observed enough of their parents' operations to understand that some of their associates were even more violent and unpredictable than Ezekiel and Judith themselves, and they used their advanced knowledge of appointments and meetings to help Margaret avoid potentially fatal encounters. The turning point came in September 1685, when the twins provided Margaret with specific information about where their parents kept their most incriminating records. A hidden compartment behind a false wall in Ezekiel's study that contained detailed financial ledgers documenting 15 years of criminal activity. These ledgers included not only records of payments received for each witch trial, but also itemized lists of confiscated properties, their estimated values, and notations about preparation costs and witness fees that revealed the systematic nature of their operations. Margaret's discovery of these records provided her with irrefutable proof that the Harrington siblings had been murdering innocent people for money, but it also placed her in mortal danger. She understood that if Ezekiel and Judith discovered her knowledge, they would not hesitate to eliminate her using the same methods they had perfected against their other victims. Her only hope lay in finding a way to expose their crimes while protecting herself and the twins from retaliation. The solution she ultimately chose demonstrated both courage and strategic thinking that would have impressed even experienced criminal investigators. Rather than attempting to flee with the evidence or confront the siblings directly, Margaret began secretly copying the most damning documents while simultaneously establishing contact with Father Benedict Thorne, a Jesuit priest who had recently arrived in Boston from France and who possessed both the theological knowledge to understand supernatural implications and the political connections to investigate powerful colonial figures. Father Benedict Thorne's investigation into the Harrington siblings began with skepticism, but quickly evolved into horror as he uncovered layer after layer of systematic evil that had operated virtually unchecked for more than 2 decades. Margaret Caldwell's initial approach to the priest had been cautious and indirect, as she understood that direct accusations against such powerful and respected figures would likely result in her own destruction through the same methods they had used against their other victims. But the evidence that Margaret gradually shared with Father Thorne, copies of financial ledgers, witness lists with notations about payments and threats, and most damning of all, detailed maps marking the locations of confiscated properties and their current ownership, painted a picture of criminal enterprise that exceeded even the priest's worst expectations about human capacity for evil. Father Thorn's expertise in both theology and natural philosophy made him uniquely qualified to understand the full implications of what Margaret had discovered. Unlike colonial authorities who might dismiss supernatural accusations as beyond their jurisdiction, or medical professionals who might focus solely on the children's physical condition, the priest possessed the knowledge and authority to investigate both the criminal and moral dimensions of the Harrington case. His decision to visit the manor in October 1685 was presented to the siblings as a routine pastoral call. The new priest, seeking to introduce himself to prominent members of the colonial community and offer spiritual guidance to a family that had suffered the tragedy of difficult births. Ezekiel and Judith, confident in their ability to manipulate religious authorities, welcomed the visit as an opportunity to further legitimize their standing in the community while gathering intelligence about potential threats to their operations. What they failed to anticipate was Father Thorn's specific training in recognizing deception and his expertise in identifying the psychological and spiritual consequences of systematic evil. Within minutes of entering the manor, the priest detected atmospheric disturbances that suggested the presence of profound spiritual corruption, not supernatural intervention, but rather the psychological residue left by decades of calculated murder and moral degradation. The priest's request to meet the children was ostensibly motivated by pastoral concern for young souls dealing with physical challenges, but his true purpose was to assess whether Gabriel and Raphael possessed the intelligence and awareness necessary to serve as witnesses against their parents. Margaret's written reports had suggested that the twins understood far more about their situation than their parents realized, but Father Thorn needed to evaluate their capabilities firsthand before risking their safety by involving them in his investigation. When Father Thorn finally gained access to the children's chambers, what he encountered there exceeded even Margaret's detailed descriptions in its combination of tragedy and possibility. Gabriel and Raphael, despite their severe physical limitations and obvious daily pain, demonstrated intellectual sophistication and emotional maturity that was remarkable for children of any age, particularly those who had been isolated from normal social interaction for their entire lives. More significantly, the twins showed no fear of the priest despite never having seen him before, and instead displayed what could only be described as relief and hope. They had clearly been waiting for someone with the authority and courage to challenge their parents, and they immediately began attempting to communicate information about crimes they had witnessed and evidence they had observed being hidden or destroyed. Father Thorn's theological training had included instruction in ministering to victims of extreme cruelty, and he recognized in these children the same combination of suffering, awareness, and desperate hope that he had observed in survivors of torture and persecution. But unlike those previous cases where the victims had been adults capable of explaining their situations and seeking justice, Gabriel and Raphael were trapped by their physical limitations and their complete dependence on the very people who were responsible for both their condition and their suffering. The priest's departure from the manor was superficially cordial, but all parties understood that a fundamental confrontation had begun. Father Thorn had seen enough to confirm his worst suspicions about the children's situation and their parents' character, while Ezekiel and Judith had recognized in his manner and questions a level of perception and determination that posed unprecedented danger to their carefully constructed lives. The investigation that Father Thorn launched upon returning to Boston was methodical, comprehensive, and conducted with the full resources of the Catholic Church's administrative and intelligence networks. Unlike the crude legal systems of the individual colonies, the Church possessed sophisticated methods for gathering evidence, analyzing testimony, and building cases against powerful individuals who believed themselves above earthly justice. Within 3 weeks, Father Thorn had assembled a complete dossier on the Harrington siblings' activities, including financial records subpoenaed from colonial banks, testimonies from surviving relatives of their victims, and most damning of all, a detailed confession from Marcus Fletcher, a former accomplice who had helped plant evidence and coach witnesses for several witch trials in exchange for or payment and protection from his own legal troubles. Marcus Fletcher's confession revealed the true scope of the Harrington criminal enterprise, including details about their methods for selecting victims, creating false evidence, and coordinating with corrupt officials to ensure favorable legal outcomes. But more importantly for Father Thorne's purposes, Fletcher's testimony included specific information about the siblings' decision to marry each other and their explicit discussions about using their children's condition to further expand their wealth through private exhibitions to wealthy individuals curious about medical anomalies. This revelation added an additional layer of horror to an already overwhelming case. Ezekiel and Judith had not only condemned innocent people to death for financial gain, but they had also brought children into the world through an incestuous union specifically designed to protect their criminal empire, and they were now planning to exploit their offspring's suffering for additional profit. But Father Thorne's most powerful weapon in his campaign against the Harrington siblings proved to be the children themselves. Gabriel and Raphael, despite their youth and physical limitations, possessed detailed memories of conversations and events that provided crucial corroboration for the evidence found in their parents' records. More importantly, their obvious intelligence and moral awareness made them compelling witnesses whose testimony could not be dismissed as the fantasies of damaged minds. The priest's careful interviews with the twins, conducted during secret visits arranged by Margaret Caldwell, revealed a level of systematic abuse and exploitation that went far beyond simple neglect. Ezekiel and Judith had not only hidden their children from the world to protect their own reputations, but they had also used the twins' isolation and dependence to conduct psychological experiments designed to test the limits of human endurance and adaptability. Gabriel and Raphael described years of being subjected to painful medical procedures without anesthesia, being forced to perform intellectual tasks under threat of withdrawn food or comfort, and being used as subjects for their parents' theories about the relationship between physical deformity and mental capacity. Most horrifying of all, they revealed that their parents had been systematically documenting their development and behavior with the intention of selling detailed reports to European physicians interested in the effects of consanguinity on human offspring. The final months of 1685 brought escalating tension to the Harrington manor as multiple forces converged to threaten the siblings' carefully constructed empire of blood and deception. Father Thorne's investigation had reached the point where he possessed irrefutable evidence of their crimes, but he faced the delicate challenge of exposing such powerful and dangerous individuals without triggering a violent response that might endanger the children and other potential witnesses. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Raphael had grown increasingly bold in their efforts to assist in their parents' downfall, using their privileged position as isolated invalids to observe and document activities that even Margaret Caldwell could not safely witness. The twins had developed sophisticated methods for recording information despite their physical limitations, creating hidden caches of written evidence that detailed their parents' ongoing criminal activities and future plans. The children's growing defiance had not gone unnoticed by their parents, who had begun to suspect that their offspring possessed more awareness and capability than they had previously realized. Ezekiel and Judith's response to this suspicion revealed the complete absence of natural parental affection that had characterized their relationship with the twins from birth. Rather than feeling pride in their children's intelligence or concern for their well-being, the siblings viewed Gabriel and Raphael's developing autonomy as a potential threat to their security. The crisis that would ultimately bring the entire criminal enterprise crashing down began in early December 1685, when Ezekiel discovered evidence that someone had been accessing his hidden financial records. Scratch marks on the false walls concealed hinges, and displaced dust patterns on the documents suggested repeated unauthorized entry to his most sensitive files. More disturbing still was the realization that whoever had gained access possessed sufficient knowledge to identify the most incriminating materials, Pages containing direct references to bribery, witness intimidation, and property fraud had been subtly marked with tiny pencil dots that would be invisible to casual inspection, but clearly indicated systematic study. Ezekiel's immediate suspicion fell upon Margaret Caldwell, whose position as household servant provided her with both opportunity and motivation to spy on her employers. But when he and Judith subjected Margaret to brutal interrogation using techniques they had perfected during their witch-hunting career, they discovered that while she indeed possessed knowledge of their crimes, she could not possibly have been responsible for all of the security breaches they had detected. The truth that their own children had been systematically gathering evidence against them for months was so far outside their psychological framework that neither sibling initially considered the possibility. They had become so accustomed to viewing Gabrielle and Raphael as helpless dependents, whose physical limitations rendered them essentially harmless, that they could not conceive of the twins as active threats to their security. This blindness to their children's capabilities proved to be a fatal miscalculation that would ultimately cost them everything they had worked to build. While Ezekiel and Judith focused their suspicions on external threats like Margaret Caldwell and Father Thorne, Gabriel and Raphael continued their intelligence-gathering activities with increasing sophistication and boldness. The twins had developed communication methods that allowed them to coordinate their efforts despite being physically separated during most daily activities. They used a combination of written messages, coded sounds, and even manipulation of household objects to share information and plan their next moves. Their physical limitations, which their parents viewed as guarantees of helplessness, had actually forced them to develop intellectual and observational skills that far exceeded those of normal children their age. By mid-December 1685, Gabriel and Raphael had compiled evidence that included not only documentation of their parents' past crimes, but also detailed intelligence about planned future operations. They had learned that Ezekiel and Judith were preparing to expand their activities into the Connecticut River Valley, where recent Indian raids had created community tensions that could be exploited for profit through accusations of supernatural collaboration with hostile forces. More immediately threatening was the twins' discovery that their parents had begun planning their elimination as potential witnesses and security risks. Gabriel and Raphael had overheard discussions about tragic accidents that might befall disabled children during the harsh winter months, and they had observed their parents making preparations that suggested an intention to dispose of them before spring arrived. The children's response to this threat demonstrated both their remarkable intelligence and their profound understanding of their parents' psychology. Rather than attempting to flee or simply warning Father Thorne about their immediate danger, Gabriel and Raphael chose to accelerate their evidence-gathering activities while simultaneously laying the groundwork for a final confrontation that would expose the full scope of their parents' evil. Their plan was both elegant and terrible in its sophistication. They would use their parents' own methods against them, orchestrating a scenario that would force Ezekiel and Judith to reveal their true nature in the presence of witnesses who possessed the authority and credibility to ensure justice. The twins understood that their physical condition made them unlikely to survive any direct conflict with their parents, but they were willing to sacrifice themselves if their deaths could guarantee the exposure of crimes that had claimed dozens of innocent lives. The opportunity they had been waiting for came on December 21st, 1685, the 10th anniversary of their parents' secret wedding, and a date that Ezekiel and Judith always marked with private celebrations that revealed their true personalities more clearly than any other occasion. This annual ritual, which the siblings viewed as a commemoration of their successful partnership in evil, provided Gabriel and Raphael with the perfect setting for their final gambit. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Harrington Manor intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The twins' plan required precise timing, complete commitment, and a level of courage that would have been remarkable in adults, let alone children who had never known life outside the walls of their prison home. But Gabriel and Raphael understood that they possessed something their parents had never expected: the moral clarity that comes from suffering injustice and the intellectual capacity to transform that clarity into effective action. The events of December 21st, 1685, unfolded with a precision that reflected months of careful planning by two 8-year-old children who had never experienced normal childhood, but had instead been forced to develop the strategic thinking of seasoned investigators. Gabriel and Raphael's plan depended on their intimate knowledge of their parents' habits, personalities, and criminal methods, combined with their unique position as witnesses whom Ezekiel and Judith consistently underestimated. The twins had arranged for Father Thorn to arrive at the manor during the evening hours when their parents traditionally conducted their anniversary celebration, a private ritual that involved reviewing their accumulated wealth, reading selected passages from their victim lists, and planning future operations. This celebration, which the siblings believed to be completely secret, actually took place in a room directly above the children's chambers, and Gabriel and Raphael had been listening to these annual recitations of evil for years. The atmosphere in the manor that December evening was thick, with an almost palpable sense of malevolence as Ezekiel and Judith prepared for their 10th anniversary celebration. The siblings had spent the day reviewing their financial records and preparing materials for what they planned to be their final winter in Massachusetts before relocating their operations to the more profitable and less scrutinized territories of the Carolina colonies. They had already begun liquidating some of their New England properties and were preparing to establish new identities that would allow them to continue their criminal enterprise in regions where their reputations had not yet preceded them. Gabriel and Raphael, confined to their chambers as always during their parents' private meetings, had spent weeks preparing for this night with the methodical precision of experienced conspirators. Despite their physical limitations, they had managed to create multiple hidden caches of evidence throughout the manor, including copies of their parents' most incriminating documents, detailed maps of confiscated properties, and written testimonies describing specific crimes they had witnessed or overheard being planned. More significantly, the twins had spent months weakening specific structural elements of the manor's construction, using tools they had fashioned from household items and techniques they had learned by studying architectural texts from their parents' extensive library. Their plan required not only perfect timing, but also an understanding of physics and engineering that would have challenged adult builders. Yet they had mastered these concepts through pure necessity and their desperate determination to escape their prison. Father Thorn's arrival at the manor was preceded by a careful reconnaissance that he had conducted over several weeks, during which he had mapped the building's layout, identified potential escape routes, and established communication protocols with Gabriel and Raphael through a system of light signals visible from their chamber windows. The priest's military background, he had served as a chaplain during European conflicts before joining the church, had provided him with tactical knowledge that proved invaluable in planning what was essentially a rescue operation disguised as a pastoral visit. The authorities who accompanied Father Thorn included not only colonial officials with arrest warrants, but also physicians prepared to examine and treat the Harrington children, legal clerks ready to catalog evidence, and even a skilled engineer whose expertise would be needed to safely extract victims from what promised to be a dangerous confrontation. This level of preparation reflected the priest's understanding that they would have only one opportunity to expose the Harrington crimes before the siblings either fled or eliminated all witnesses to their activities. When Father Thorn knocked on the manor's front door at precisely 7 o'clock that evening, Ezekiel and Judith were in the middle of their anniversary ritual, surrounded by evidence that would have made denial impossible, even if they had been inclined toward honesty. The siblings' initial response to the unexpected visit was one of annoyed confidence. They had successfully deflected official inquiries for more than 20 years and saw no reason why this occasion should prove different. But as Father Thorne explained his ostensible purpose, concern for Margaret Caldwell's welfare and a desire to offer spiritual guidance to the family during the difficult winter season, both Ezekiel and Judith began to sense that something was fundamentally different about this visitor. The priest's manner was too assured, his questions too specific, and his knowledge of their household arrangements too detailed for a casual pastoral call. The moment of truth came when Father Thorne requested permission to visit Gabriel and Raphael, ostensibly to offer prayers for their continued health and comfort. The siblings' immediate instinct was to refuse this request with their usual explanations about the children's fragile condition and susceptibility to excitement, but they realized that such refusal might itself seem suspicious to someone who was clearly paying closer attention than previous visitors. Their decision to grant Father Thorne access to the children's chambers proved to be the fatal mistake that would destroy everything they had built over 2 decades of systematic murder and theft. When the priest entered the twins' room, followed by Ezekiel and Judith, who wanted to monitor the conversation, he immediately implemented the signal system that he and the children had previously arranged. Gabriel and Raphael's response was immediate and devastating. Despite their parents' presence, the twins began reciting a detailed account of specific crimes they had witnessed, complete with dates, victim names, and descriptions of evidence locations. Their voices, though distorted by their physical condition, carried an authority and precision that made their testimony undeniably credible. On the night of September 14th, in the year 1679, Gabriel began, his words carefully enunciated despite the effort required. Our father and mother met with Marcus Fletcher in the cellar to plan the accusation of Thomas Caldwell. Mother provided Fletcher with silver coins taken from Rebecca Whitmore's confiscated jewelry, and father gave him detailed instructions about where to hide the poppet that would be discovered during Caldwell's barn search. Raphael continued the recitation without pause, demonstrating the coordinated preparation that had made their testimony so devastating. The poppet contained hair taken from Caldwell's youngest daughter during a forced medical examination our parents conducted under pretense of checking for supernatural marks. Fletcher was instructed to place the poppet beneath the anvil in Caldwell's forge, where it would be discovered by witnesses who had been told exactly where to look. The psychological impact of hearing their most carefully guarded secrets recited by their own children in the presence of a priest who clearly possessed the authority to act on such testimony was devastating to Ezekiel and Judith's composure. For the first time in their criminal careers, they found themselves completely unprepared for a threat they had never anticipated. Betrayal by victims they had assumed were helpless and ignorant. But the twins were far from finished with their revelations. Gabriel and Raphael had spent years memorizing not only their parents' past crimes, but also their current activities and future plans. They described hidden caches of stolen property, detailed the bribery networks that had protected their parents from investigation, and most damaging of all, revealed the existence of additional victims whose deaths had been concealed so successfully that authorities had never suspected murder. In the chest beneath the floorboards of the study's eastern corner, Raphael continued, his voice growing stronger as he realized that rescue was finally at hand. There are 37 pieces of jewelry taken from executed women, including the wedding ring of Mary Hutchins, who was hanged for witchcraft in 1681 after father accused her of cursing his livestock. Gabriel picked up the narrative seamlessly. Mary Hutchins was innocent of all charges. Father killed her cow using poison he purchased from a merchant in Boston, then claimed the animal's death was proof of supernatural interference. Mary's property, including 12 acres of prime farmland and her late husband's blacksmith tools, was divided between the town treasury and our parents as payment for identifying the supposed witch. The detailed accuracy of the children's testimony, combined with their obvious intelligence and the physical evidence of their terrible condition, created an overwhelming case that no rational observer could dismiss or explain away. Father Thorne had brought with him not only the legal authority to investigate the Harrington crimes, but also witnesses whose credibility could not be questioned and documentation methods that would preserve every word of the twins' revelations. Ezekiel and Judith's response to this devastating exposure revealed the complete absence of natural human emotions that had characterized their entire criminal enterprise. Rather than showing shock, remorse, or even fear for their children's welfare, the siblings immediately began calculating how to eliminate the witnesses and escape the consequences of their crimes. Their first attempt at damage control involved trying to discredit Gabriel and Raphael's testimony by claiming that the children suffered from delusions caused by their physical condition. But this strategy collapsed when Father Thorne produced copies of documents that corroborated every detail the twins had provided, along with testimony from other witnesses who had independently confirmed specific elements of their account. Realizing that denial was impossible and that their criminal enterprise was about to be completely exposed, Ezekiel and Judith implemented the emergency plan they had developed for exactly this scenario. Hidden throughout the manor were weapons, escape routes, and contingency funds that would allow them to eliminate all witnesses and flee to territories where colonial authority could not reach them. The violence that followed was swift and brutal, but it unfolded exactly as Gabriel and Raphael had anticipated and planned. The twins had spent months studying their parents' emergency procedures and had developed countermeasures designed to protect their rescuers while ensuring that Ezekiel and Judith could not escape justice. When Ezekiel drew a concealed pistol and attempted to shoot Father Thorne, he discovered that the weapon's firing mechanism had been subtly sabotaged by small metal fragments that Gabriel had painstakingly inserted into the barrel over many weeks. The gun exploded in his hand, causing severe injuries that left him unable to continue fighting. Judith's attempt to use a hidden knife against the colonial officials was thwarted when she triggered one of several floor traps that Raphael had prepared by loosening specific floorboards in strategic locations. Her fall not only incapacitated her, but also activated a series of mechanical devices that the twins had constructed to barricade doors and windows, preventing any possibility of escape. The final confrontation took place in the manor's main hall, where the structural modifications that Gabriel and Raphael had made over many months finally achieved their intended purpose. The twins had calculated the precise amount of damage needed to make specific portions of the building unstable, while leaving safe passages for their intended rescuers. When Ezekiel and Judith realized that their escape routes had been blocked and their weapons rendered useless, they made one final desperate attempt to silence their children permanently. But Gabriel and Raphael had anticipated this response and had prepared their ultimate defense. A coordinated collapse of the manor's central support structure that would trap their parents while creating protective shelter around themselves and their rescuers. The twins' engineering calculations proved to be remarkably accurate. The building's collapse occurred exactly as they had planned, creating a debris field that pinned Ezekiel and Judith beneath massive wooden beams, while leaving Gabriel, Raphael, Father Thorne, and the colonial officials in a protected alcove that remained structurally sound. The physical destruction of the manor served multiple purposes beyond simply stopping the siblings' escape attempt. The collapse exposed hidden rooms and concealed storage areas that contained additional evidence of their crimes, including preserved documents, stolen property, and even the remains of victims whose deaths had never been officially recorded. Most significantly, the destruction of the building that had served as both prison and torture chamber for Gabriel and Raphael represented a symbolic end to their captivity and the beginning of their liberation. The twins had literally brought down the walls that had confined them for 8 years, using their intelligence and determination to transform their physical limitations into strategic advantages. When rescue workers finally cleared enough debris to reach the survivors, they found a scene that perfectly illustrated the moral dimensions of the Harrington case. Ezekiel and Judith lay dead beneath the rubble, their faces showing the shock and disbelief of criminals who had never imagined that their own children could orchestrate their downfall. Gabriel and Raphael, though injured and exhausted, were very much alive and eager to continue providing testimony that would expose the full scope of their parents' criminal enterprise. The twins' survival and their obvious intelligence made them compelling witnesses whose testimony would prove crucial in the legal proceedings that followed. But more importantly, their courage in exposing their parents' crimes, despite the enormous personal risk, demonstrated that physical limitations need not constrain moral agency or the pursuit of justice. The aftermath of the Harrington Manor's collapse sent shockwaves throughout colonial Massachusetts that would influence legal procedures, religious practices, and community vigilance for generations to come. The detailed evidence recovered from the ruins, combined with Gabriel and Raphael's comprehensive testimony, provided irrefutable proof of systematic judicial murder that forced colonial authorities to confront the terrifying possibility that other witch trials might have been similarly corrupted by greed and manipulation. The immediate legal consequences were unprecedented in their scope and severity. Within days of the manor's destruction, colonial courts had issued posthumous convictions against Ezekiel and Judith Harrington on 57 counts of murder, along with numerous additional charges related to fraud, bribery, judicial corruption, and conspiracy. The evidence was so overwhelming and the crimes so extensive that legal scholars would later cite the Harrington case as the most comprehensive criminal prosecution in colonial American history. But the legal ramifications extended far beyond the posthumous punishment of two dead criminals. The systematic nature of the Harrington crimes, combined with evidence of their connections to corrupt officials throughout the colonial legal system, triggered a comprehensive review of witch trial procedures that revealed disturbing patterns of abuse and manipulation in communities across New England. Father Benedict Thorne's investigation had uncovered not only the Harrington crimes, but also evidence that similar schemes had operated in other colonies, suggesting that the abuse of supernatural accusations for financial gain was far more widespread than authorities had previously suspected. This revelation contributed to growing skepticism about witch trials and helped accelerate the legal reforms that would eventually end the period of supernatural persecution in colonial America. The financial empire built on blood money was systematically dismantled over the course of 3 years, requiring the creation of special legal procedures to handle the complexity of unwinding decades of fraudulent property acquisitions. Properties worth more than £25,000 were identified as having been obtained through criminal means, and colonial courts faced the unprecedented challenge of restoring stolen assets to the families of victims who had been murdered decades earlier. The process of financial restitution revealed the true scope of the Harrington operations and provided additional evidence of their systematic approach to crime. Detailed records recovered from the manor's ruins showed that the siblings had maintained meticulous documentation of their activities, including maps of confiscated properties, lists of bribed officials, and even financial projections for future criminal enterprises they had planned to establish in other colonies. Gabriel and Raphael Harrington, despite the horrific circumstances of their birth and childhood, proved to be far more resilient than anyone had expected. Under the careful supervision of Dr. William Harvey, a royal physician brought from London specifically to study their condition, they not only survived their ordeal, but began to thrive in ways that challenged contemporary understanding of human development and adaptation. Dr. Harvey's initial examination of the twins revealed that their physical condition, while severe, was not as limiting as their parents had claimed. Much of their apparent helplessness had been artificially imposed through deliberate neglect and psychological manipulation designed to keep them dependent and controllable. With proper medical care, nutrition, and physical therapy, Gabriel and Raphael demonstrated remarkable improvement in their mobility and overall health. More significantly, their intellectual capabilities, which had been evident from early childhood, flourished when they were finally provided with proper education and social interaction. Within months of their rescue, the twins were reading at levels that exceeded most adults, demonstrating mathematical abilities that impressed university scholars, and showing artistic talents that drew attention from intellectuals throughout the colonies. Dr. Harvey's detailed documentation of their progress became foundational texts in the emerging field of medical psychology, demonstrating that intellectual capacity was not determined by physical appearance or condition. His reports challenged prevailing assumptions about disability and intelligence, showing that proper care and education could unlock extraordinary potential even in the most challenging circumstances. The twins' testimony continued to be crucial in the legal proceedings that followed their rescue. Their detailed memories of their parents' conversations and activities provided corroboration for documentary evidence and helped prosecutors build cases against dozens of surviving accomplices who had aided the Harrington crimes over the years. But perhaps more importantly, their obvious intelligence and moral clarity made them compelling witnesses whose accounts could not be dismissed as fantasies or fabrications. The psychological evaluation of Gabriel and Raphael, conducted by Dr. Harvey and his colleagues, revealed no signs of the mental damage that might have been expected from their traumatic early experiences. Despite years of isolation, abuse, and psychological manipulation, the twins demonstrated remarkable emotional stability and moral development that suggested an innate resilience that had protected them from the worst effects of their ordeal. This resilience proved crucial as Gabriel and Raphael adapted to life outside their prison home and began to interact with the wider colonial community. Their physical condition made them objects of curiosity and sometimes fear, but their intelligence and dignity quickly won the respect of those who took the time to know them as individuals rather than simply as medical anomalies. The transformation of public perception regarding the twins became a powerful argument for the inclusion and education of individuals with physical differences. Gabriel and Raphael's success in overcoming their circumstances provided evidence that human potential could not be judged by physical appearance, and that society benefited when all individuals were given opportunities to contribute their talents and insights. Their adult lives proved to be as remarkable as their childhood ordeal had been traumatic. Gabriel developed into a respected legal scholar, whose writings on evidence, witness protection, and judicial corruption influenced colonial jurisprudence for decades. Despite his physical limitations, he became a sought-after consultant for complex criminal cases and helped establish the first formal procedures for protecting child witnesses in legal proceedings. Gabriel's legal innovations were directly informed by his childhood experiences and his understanding of how vulnerable individuals could be exploited by those in positions of authority. His work led to the development of special courts designed to handle cases involving child witnesses, enhanced protections for individuals with disabilities involved in legal proceedings, and improved methods for gathering and preserving testimony from vulnerable populations. Raphael channeled his experiences into becoming a physician specializing in the care of children with physical abnormalities and victims of abuse. His medical practice was revolutionary in its emphasis on treating patients as complete human beings rather than simply collections of symptoms, and his therapeutic methods stressed dignity, education, and social integration rather than isolation and shame. Dr. Raphael Harrington, as he became known throughout the medical community, established the first school in colonial America specifically designed to educate children with disabilities. His institution demonstrated that physical limitations need not constrain intellectual achievement, and that proper support and education could enable individuals with various conditions to contribute meaningfully to society. The school's success challenged prevailing attitudes about disability and education throughout the colonies, inspiring the establishment of similar institutions and contributing to broader social changes in how communities treated their most vulnerable members. Raphael's educational philosophy emphasized the potential within every individual and the responsibility of society to provide opportunities for that potential to be realized. Both twins married and established families of their own, their children showing no trace of their grandparents' moral corruption or their parents' physical challenges. The genetic abnormalities that had resulted from Ezekiel and Judith's incestuous union proved to be non-hereditary. allowing Gabrielle and Raphael to break the cycle of suffering that had defined their early years. The twins' success in creating loving, stable families was particularly significant given their traumatic childhood experiences. Their ability to form healthy relationships and raise well-adjusted children demonstrated that even the most severe early trauma need not determine the course of an entire life when proper support and intervention are provided. The Harrington case had profound implications for understanding family dynamics, child development, and the long-term effects of abuse. Gabriel and Raphael's recovery and subsequent achievements became powerful evidence that resilience and healing were possible even in the most extreme circumstances, provided that victims received appropriate care and support. The investigation led by Father Thorne also had lasting effects on religious and legal institutions throughout colonial America. The priest's methodology for gathering evidence, protecting witnesses, and building cases against powerful criminals became a model for future investigations and helped establish protocols that would influence law enforcement for generations. Father Thorne's detailed documentation of the Harrington case became required reading for legal scholars and religious authorities, demonstrating how systematic evil could flourish when communities failed to maintain proper oversight of their institutions and leaders. His work contributed to reforms in both civil and religious governance that strengthened protections against abuse of authority. The physical site of the Harrington Manor was designated as a memorial ground by colonial authorities, its ruins left undisturbed as a reminder of how easily justice can be corrupted when communities allow fear and superstition to override critical thinking and moral courage. The memorial, maintained by funds established through the sale of confiscated Harrington properties, served as an educational site where visitors could learn about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of protecting vulnerable community members. The simple stone marker that still stands today bears not only the date of the siblings' deaths, but also an inscription commissioned by Gabriel and Raphael. Here lies the evidence that evil is not supernatural. It is a human choice that can be made by ordinary people who value comfort over conscience. Let all who pass remember that justice depends on the courage of those who refuse to remain silent when confronted with wrongdoing. Perhaps most significantly, the Harrington case demonstrated that children, regardless of their physical condition or social status, possess inherent dignity and moral agency that must be respected and protected. Gabriel and Raphael's courage in exposing their parents' crimes, despite their complete dependence on those same parents for survival, challenged contemporary assumptions about childhood, disability, and moral responsibility. Their story became a powerful argument for children's rights and protections that would influence legal and social developments throughout American history. The recognition that children could be both victims of abuse and agents of their own liberation contributed to evolving concepts of childhood that emphasized protection, education, and respect for individual dignity. The twins' legacy extended beyond their immediate historical context to influence broader discussions about disability rights, victim advocacy, and the prevention of systematic abuse. Their demonstration that physical limitations need not constrain intellectual or moral development challenged prejudices that had persisted for centuries and contributed to more inclusive concepts of human potential and social responsibility. The Harrington case continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about child protection, disability rights, and the prevention of institutional abuse. Gabriel and Raphael's story demonstrates that individuals have the capacity for remarkable resilience and moral insight when given the tools and support they need to overcome adversity, regardless of their physical condition or traumatic experiences. Their ultimate triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances serves as enduring evidence that human dignity cannot be destroyed by abuse or neglect, and that society has both the opportunity and the obligation to support all individuals in realizing their potential for contribution and achievement. This mystery shows us how communities can become complicit in evil when fear and superstition override critical thinking and moral courage. The Harrington siblings succeeded for nearly 2 decades, not because they were supernatural monsters, but because they understood how to exploit human weaknesses and turn neighbors against each other for profit. Their ultimate defeat came not from divine intervention, but from the determination of brave individuals who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. What do you think of this story? Do you believe there might have been other witch hunters throughout colonial America who operated similar schemes using supernatural fears to cover systematic murder for profit? Leave your comment below with your theories about how many other divine judgments might actually have been calculated crimes. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries about the dark side of American history. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another case of colonial evil that most people would rather forget.